Welcome. I'm Leslie KATZ, arts editor of Bay City News and Local News Matters. I've had the pleasure of reading these truly fascinating memoirs by our panelists. I finished each one in a matter of several sittings, so let me tell you a little bit about them. RENATA ARON, who was born and raised in New Jersey, lives in Oakland. She was senior editor on the special projects team at T. Brand Studio at the New York Times. She earned degrees in Russian history and Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies, and also completed coursework toward a PhD in anthropology and gender and sexuality studies. She writes about books, food, art, and feminism. Her criticism and essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Medium, among many publications. Her first full-length book, the searing memoir, Good Morning, Destroyer of Men's Souls, a memoir of women, addiction, and love, was published by Crown in 2020. Summer Brenner is the author of a dozen works of poetry and fiction that include short story collections, award-winning young adult novels, noir thrillers, and the occasional essay. Her writing has appeared in dozens of anthologies and literary magazines. Performances of her work include The Missing Lover, a one-act play with staged readings, theatrical productions of Richmond Tales, Lost Secrets of the Iron Triangle, and Oakland Tales, Lost Secrets of the Town, and recordings and performances with music. She's given scores of readings in the United States, France, and Japan. She was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and is a longtime resident of Berkeley. Her 2024 book, Dust, a Memoir, her first book of nonfiction, details her childhood growing up as a genteel Jew in Georgia. Flashes forward describing how, after fleeing the South, she ended up in California and reconnects with her brother. L. John Harris, a Los Angeles native, studied art at UC Berkeley from 1965 to 1969. In the 1970s, while working part-time jobs at Berkeley food businesses, including the Cheese Board, Chez Panisse, and the Swallow Cafe, he wrote articles for the Los Angeles Free Press and co-published how-to books and published the Book of Garlic in 1974 and the official Garlic Lover's Handbook in 1986. In 81, he founded a specialty cookbook publisher, and in 1988 launched his Foodoodle byline in Bay Area magazines. In the 90s, he turned to documentary films, wrote and co-produced Divine Food, 100 Years in the Kosher Delicatessen Trade, and wrote and co-produced the PBS special Los Romeros, The Royal Family of the Guitar. A lifelong classical guitar aficionado, he has sponsored performance programs at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and went on to donate his guitar collection to the school. His book, Portrait in Red, A Paris Obsession, was published by Heyday Books in November 2024. He lives in Berkeley in a 100-year-old Bernard Maybeck-designed Italian-style residence that's also the site of performances, readings, and private events. Zach Rogo is the author, editor, or translator of more than 20 books or plays. His 9th book of poems, Irreverent Litanies, was published by Regal House. His play, Colette Uncensored, co-authored with Laurie Holt, had its first public reading at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and has been staged in London, Catalonia, San Francisco, Indonesia, and Portland. His song lyrics include Love for Just Part, sung by Carrie Wicks. He's taught an MFA creative writing programs and serves as a contributing editor of Catamaran Literary Reader. His memoir, Hugging My Father's Ghost, was released in 2024, and his translation of a book by the French writer who inspired La Boheme, and I'm not going to pronounce the man's name because I can't, is coming out soon, and it's called The Water Drinkers. Zach, there you go. There we have it. Now I'm going to turn it over to each of the authors who are going to speak a little bit more in detail about their books and perhaps read from them. So how do we want to do this? You want to go this way?
Sure. You starting with me?
Go, John.
I'm not ready.
Oh, you're not.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for agreeing to do this. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Hillside Club. You could say that my book puts the lie to the platitude, it's the journey that counts, not the destination. Wrong. It is the destination that counts. It's just not the destination you thought you were going to. And it's not particularly surprising that the words destination and destiny have the same Latin root, destinare. This was my destiny because, like all of us, we don't know exactly what we're doing when we start. And we discover it as every artist does in every medium. We find out what it is when it's done. And even then, we may not know what it is. And that takes us into what I call the afterlife of a work of art. And it keeps writing itself. It keeps writing itself. Now, we have 10 minutes, so let me get on with it. Part one of my book, it's divided into 4 parts. Part one is The Journey Begins. And I go to Paris in 2015 to write an article about the croque monsieur, the history and the status of the iconic dish that you get in every Paris cafe and bistro. It's sort of a fancy version of our grilled ham and cheese. Or there's an Italian version. There's versions everywhere because ham and cheese is ubiquitous. But the croque monsieur has bechamel sauce, it has a special bread, it has a special ham, it has a special cheese. And I wanted to taste as many as I could stomach and write for a magazine that I was working with called Zester Daily. And so I go to Paris to write about the croque monsieur. My first croque monsieur was at a cafe called La Palette on the left bank, very fancy, near the Latin Quarter. And I have my first croque of my trip. And I write notes, and I take pictures, and I get up and I leave, and I'm walking home to my apartment on Boulevard Saint-Germain, and there, leaning against a building on the corner of Rue Guénégaud and Rue Mazarine is this painting, sitting against a pile of junk, leaning against an apartment building between 2 art galleries. And I can't imagine that anyone is throwing this out. And I stop in my tracks, and I pick it up, and I start thinking, what is this? Is there a signature? Can I take it? You know, I was feeling like nervous. I was feeling nervous. So let me read to you from the book about that moment of discovering this painting. She looks at me with dark, sad eyes. A young girl about 10 years old, perhaps older. The sadness I sense is deeper than her years would suggest. Something you might see in the eyes of a refugee, a runaway, or a victim of abuse. She seems so alone, but she is not alone. There is someone in the room with her, the artist, who has painted the portrait of a girl wearing a vivid red head cover. Who is this mysterious girl? Who is the artist, male or female, French or foreign? From where I'm standing on the corner of Rue Guénégaud and Rue Mazarine in Paris's Saint-Germain-des-Prés, I don't see a signature on the canvas, though a date is prominent in the upper right-hand corner, 12/31/35. It's on the cover of the book. Now, after several minutes of ruminating on whether I should take this painting and what is this painting and who is this painting, I go back to the apartment with the painting, and I'll read a section. Back at the apartment, I assess my mysterious find, a captivating image of a young girl, presumably living in Paris, just 5 dark years before the onset of World War II and the German occupation. Edgar Degas once said, "We were created to look at one another, weren't we?" I can't stop looking at her. It feels like an important moment at the outset of my stay in Paris, but I can't say exactly why. That it will launch me on a journey that will change my life, I cannot begin to know. So that's from the prologue. Now, I almost immediately name the painting The Girl in Red, because I had just seen Gustav Klimt's Woman in Gold in New York after seeing the film Woman in Gold in Berkeley. And so I think I had in my brain this powerful painting that I saw in New York. So when I found this painting, I think I immediately decided Girl in Red. And I spent the next 3 weeks in Paris having croque monsieur by day and writing Facebook posts about this painting by night, and was getting incredible feedback from friends back home. And the question was, certain themes came up. Is it unfinished? Well, yes, it's sort of unfinished. There's no background information. Other themes came up. It's anonymous. Therefore, does it have any value? What is value in art? That was another theme. The color symbolism struck me, that just basically red and black. And of course, in Paris, when you think of red and black, you think of Stendhal and the red and the black. And so I actually got a copy of the book at Shakespeare and Company and tried to get through it, and I couldn't get through it. But there was symbolism in the red. I won't go into it. There was symbolism in the book, red and black, and there is symbolism in red and black. I mean, red is blood, black is death, black is ministers, red is soldiers, and that symbolism is in Stendhal's book. And in a way, it's in this painting, because the painting is dated 1935. So one of the themes that I started pursuing was, what happened in Paris on January 12th, 1935? So there's a chapter in the book that traces elements of what's going on in Europe as it leads towards the war. And I have, clips from newspaper articles and photographs of Paris on that particular day. It actually snowed that day. So the themes continued to emerge, even back in Berkeley. And on my way back to Berkeley, I stopped in London, and there in London was the Courtauld Gallery with a show that had just opened, just in time for me to get there. The theme, unfinished. All the paintings in the Courtauld collection that are unfinished, with just lots of commentary on what unfinished art means, even with artists intending to leave things unfinished. There's a whole thing about Renaissance art called non finito, which Michelangelo left the base of his marble statues unfinished, because the idea was that the artist's intentions and thoughts can be understood from what he doesn't do as much as from what he does do. Now, I soon decided that this journey is going to continue, and I'm going to go back to Paris and keep looking for the source of this painting. And I decided to go back with a poster in French, a wanted poster that says, wanted information leading to the identification of this painting, with my email address at the bottom. And I went with 80 of these posters and mounted them the next summer, 2016. I'm back in Paris. I'm not writing about croque monsieur. I'm not writing about food at all. I'm just there to write about art. And so this is part of this transformation that is starting to happen with me as I find myself going back to my earlier years as an artist in the art department. And so I put up the wanted poster all over the neighborhood where I found the painting. Cafes, bookstores, art galleries, kiosks, just walls. I mean, all over Paris, you see posters mounted everywhere with art shows and theater productions and, Vivaldi concerts. And so I'm going to read to you from the most emotional posting that I made at Picasso's house on Rue des Grands Augustins, number 7. And the reason that this was such a powerful, besides it being Picasso's home for several years between 1936 and 1938, I believe. He painted Guernica there in 1937. But he discovered it because Dora Maar met him in 1935 on the set of a Jean Renoir film. And they fell in love, and she discovered this residence in 1935, and then they moved into it in 1936. And it was also an address in a Balzac novella called The Unknown Masterpiece, where a crazy artist named Frenhofer, who is at the end of his life and wants one last painting and believes that this last painting in this novella is his lover who has died, but she stays on the canvas and has come to life for him, and he believes that she's living on the canvas. And he invites some students to come look at her, and they don't see anything on the canvas. It's just a mess of color and lines with one foot, realistic foot at the bottom of the canvas. And they say, Frenhofer, there's nothing on your canvas. He can't handle it. In fact, he commits suicide that night at the end of the novel. Now, this was an object lesson for Picasso. Matisse loved this book. Cézanne loved this book because it was sort of an object lesson about representation and mimetic theory and in painting.
Can we hear your
Oh,
yeah. We're getting on to 10 minutes.
we are?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I get carried away. It's part of the journey. Outside the gate to Picasso's residence, I wonder about my obsession with the girl and consider the absurd possibility that this is all some grandiose Frenhoferian, that's the character, Frenhoferian aberration, the confusion of a girl portrayed on canvas with the real girl. But there is method in my madness. As I attach my poster to the wall just below Picasso's memorial plaque, suspecting that the concierge of the building will tear it down the same day, I believe that I am both violating and embracing the historic narrative embedded at this address. If only for one day, I have placed the girl in red and myself into the narrative. So, I go on to keep posting. My time is up. I had more to say, but we'll handle it in the question and answer session. So thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead. Go Nina.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Do you
No?
why don't we, let's just,
You want to switch?
You want to use mine?
Well, I was kind of excited about the challenge of the falling microphone. That'll work. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. It's so beautiful in here. I've never been inside here, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Leslie, for facilitating, and all of these wonderful writers. The title of my book, Good Morning, Destroyer of Men's Souls, sounds kind of scary, but it's actually a quote from Carrie Nation, who was a temperance crusader, and that was her greeting to bartenders. My memoir is about my life along some points in my life along the axis of addiction, living alongside alcoholism and addiction. But it's also a cultural history of what we call codependency. I set out to find a book, a literary book, about codependency, not a self-help book. And I was surprised to find that nothing of the sort existed. So I followed Toni Morrison's dictum that if there's a book you want to read and it doesn't exist, you must write it. And this book is It's about, I grew up in New Jersey, the middle of 3 sisters, and when I was about 13 or 14, my older sister got addicted to heroin, and that threw our family into a decade of chaos, and she fortunately is still here and thriving, in fact. But I later ended up having a long, tortured romantic relationship with a hardcore addict, and became just sort of really interested in my own behaviors in relation to these addicts in my life, and also really wanted to understand the history of those behaviors and what it was like for women to live alongside alcoholism in other times and places. So this book is really researched, and it ended up being kind of a hybrid between my personal narrative and history. But the portion I'm going to read tonight is, it's about when I left New Jersey at 17 with my 2 best friends and drove to San Francisco to live in San Francisco for a year. So it's about my impressions of this area, which I later made my home. I've been here now for 15 years. So you won't get too much dark stuff in this section, but there's plenty of it in the book. San Francisco had a darkness that was entirely unlike what I knew from the East Coast, maybe because my East Coast was circumscribed as my parents had designed it. I was a child of the suburbs, carted into the city periodically for edification. In New York or Philadelphia, we passed through bad neighborhoods, but only on the way to better neighborhoods, to eat, see family, look at art. Or my father, a journalist who knew every square inch of New Jersey, led us on day trips to the Ironbound in Newark for paella, or the back room of a Middle Eastern market in Patterson, because they had the best hummus. On the East Coast, if you're in a bad situation or on a scary block, you know. Things look different, feel different, people regard you differently. Someone might ask you bluntly what you're doing there, whether maybe you're lost. But in California, everything was so pretty. The sky was bigger, industrial expanses looked functional, not forgotten, as they did in Elizabeth or Linden or on Brooklyn's waterfront. Even decrepitude had a soft-hued beauty, the late-day sun pouring caramel light over powder blue and milkshake pink houses. Danger was illegible to me there. I couldn't read the streets, and the menace that dwelled there felt less criminal and more psychotic. San Francisco in the 1990s had a distinctly sinister Manson vibe, the lingering hangover of the far-gone hippie creeps who'd dropped too much acid, a small, bedraggled army clad in muted rainbow hues with pale eyes and leathery faces, peace and love gone sour. San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, even Marin, these were places where you could meet someone, find yourself deep in conversation with them, and not realize for 20 minutes that they were raving mad. A person's absolute nuttiness was a revelation that dawned slowly, unreliably, and was all the scarier for it. The city also felt freshly ravaged by AIDS, the animating terror of my youth. There were faces that bore the shadow of illness and grief, and there was a traumatized quality to many places. The Castro, where I spent most of my time, was a cemetery of sorts, haunted by lives extinguished quickly, painfully, and senselessly. I worked among young men who had lost their pack. I'm going to skip ahead a few pages. That year, El Nino hit the Bay Area, bringing unexpected torrents, mudslides, and long, dark, monochromatic days of rain. When I think back on that year, I remember the dark gray slab of sky like the too low ceiling of a shitty apartment, rain in awe-inspiring sheets and big individuated cartoon teardrops, and endless ambient drizzle, the mist that would spin my hair out into frizz and tell the truth about my Jewishness and my curls. I hated it for that. The gloom was tuned perfectly to the misery in me. It felt appropriately punishing to drag my ass uphill from one job to another in tight black pants with the cold, tinkling rain threatening my eyeliner, my bobby-pinned hairdo. 43 days of rain. We stayed inside, bored. Rachel's sister Miriam came to visit, and we made Valentines on the kitchen floor. But then, like the big reveal after a makeover scene in a movie, there would come a sunny day. The beauty of San Francisco is in these windows of redemptive splendor, we learned, the days when the fog burns off, as they say, and gives way to a piercing, almost perversely joyous sunshine. New Yorkers joke about being in an abusive relationship with the city. In San Francisco, I understood this. We were constantly being pummeled by clouds and rain, then promptly apologized to by sparkling sunshine. This is the thing the city does best, convinces you through a blustery string of freezing, gunmetal gray days that life is shit, and then when you least expect it and most need it, seems to practically shatter open, revealing a crystalline brightness that pings light around, reflects it off of everything, and air dries the pale, soaked buildings. It was a magic trick that got me every time. The gray doesn't usually give birth to the day until about noon, and back then, in the Mission, that was when the city, the parts we cared about where the young people were, revved to life. Coffee house punks came out of their houses, and bartenders began squeezing lemons into pitchers of Bloody Mary mix. On our days off, we curled up in the precious patches of sunlight that streamed through Rachel's bedroom windows on the quilt that still smelled like her house in New Jersey. Even though it never, ever got truly hot, when the sun came out, we put ice cubes into our coffee and smoked cigarettes out the window, then went to Dolores Park and kicked a soccer ball around.
See if this is working. It is, isn't it? Well, I will echo my co-readers, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to Leslie for being the moderator, and to John for organizing and bringing us all together. There are a lot of reasons that people are drawn to become artists, and it's I think it's a complex group of reasons usually, but in my case, the love of writing really comes from a search for freedom, mental freedom or emotional freedom. And I've mostly written poetry and fiction. And in both of those, you have a tremendous latitude of choices in terms of what you want to talk about, how you want to express it. And of course, a seed of all of this is this tremendous love and fascination with language itself. And coming to write Dust as a nonfiction book and a memoir that's really dedicated to the memory of my schizophrenic brother, I found myself almost in a kind of straitjacket. I felt so bound to tell the truth. And you know what's often said about fiction, it's the lie that tells the truth. But this kind of memoir had to be the truth that told the truth. It was very difficult because the subject itself was so raw. It was also miraculous because I got to live with my brother at the end of his life, my only sibling, after an absence of several decades. And that is not something that normally happens. You stay in relationship, if you're fortunate, with your family, but to actually live with them. And as I said, my brother came to live with me, and I was really kind of an unknown. I could have been a lot like our mother, who was dazzling in many ways, very independent, very ahead of her time in a way, and an artist herself. She's a wonderful painter. This is a fragment of a painting that she made of my brother, a very haunted painting and very much a revelation of who he was. But in fact, he came to a very sane home. I'm not a volatile person, and I didn't strike out unexpectedly at him. And my husband Michael and I brought him into the home and into, more importantly, really, a community of people who really treated him with the kind of respect that everyone deserves. But as a mentally ill person who had been kind of bobbed around like, you know, a piece of detritus in the sea, with no real agency. You know, that's what's taken away from people who are mentally ill, is they don't live an autonomous life. And part of that is for their own protection, and part of it is for our comfort. And so I learned so much, and although people thought that we were very courageous, and we got all kinds of compliments about that we did this, you know, that we welcomed him, that we gave him a home. It was really what he gave us. And even just talking about this many years after his death, because I wrote the book almost immediately after he died, and it took a long time to get published, it's just very emotional. You know, there are just certain things in life you just don't get over. I'm going to read a little bit from the book. It's divided into two parts. The first part is really the beginning of my life with my brother David. He was about 4.5 years younger. And it's the foundation of the story. I can't really talk about his coming to live with me without talking about all the elements that went into our childhood. So the first part of the book is really our childhood up into my very early adulthood, when he had that mental breakdown that oftentimes late adolescent and young people in their 20s have. It's, you know, it was a complete mental break. And then the book just skips ahead many, many years. So it isn't about my life and my travels and men and jobs and friends and children and, you know, all of the things that go into many of what it's called adulthood. And the second part begins with the beginning of my mother's demise. And then that was in Atlanta, as was mentioned. I'm from Atlanta. And then this series of calamities that happened to him physically, and that then allowed him to make the decision to come and live here with us. How's my time, Leslie?
About 4 minutes.
Oh, I think I can read what I plan to read in that time. The language is very simple. Simple is very effective because it builds a kind of not only rhythm and repetition, but it also creates a kind of very understated tension. And also, the simplicity suggests a kind of way of looking at the story, not as if it were behind me, but as if it was unfolding as I was living it. So there's a kind of a childlike or sort of naive voice to the book. I'll read just the first paragraph of the first chapter, The Grave, and then I'll skip ahead a little. When I first arrive, I wander through plot number 30. A man sits nearby. He's weeding a grave and crying. I feel I should leave him alone. I should abandon my search for David in case it's too close to the spot he has already claimed for his grief. But David is not in plot number 30. I find him in plot number 29, space number 7, organized something like chapter and verse. He lies on a hill facing southwest, a hill dotted with majestic trees. Around us are the tombs of many. It's a populous village of notables. I deliberately chose to place my humble brother among them. This is Mountain View Cemetery, for those of you who are familiar with it. This is about our childhood home. We were a well-to-do family, not a happy one, but We had material advantages. There's much to marvel at, but I never feel at home. I never feel comfortable. I often dream of other houses where I could live. I grow up equating big houses with loneliness and despair. I later learned that the site was a redoubt during the Civil War, and as the highest point for miles, it was a strategic lookout. Its rocks were later used to build our house, each rock tainted with war. In Buckhead, our maid came by bus across town. She came in the morning and left in the afternoon. Buses to Buckhead were filled with black women coming and going, some in uniform, some not. The new house is too far outside the city limits for bus service. Our maid now lives with us in a bedroom on the far side of the kitchen. She lives with us and makes the beds. She washes, irons, and puts away the clothes. She vacuums and sweeps. She cooks the meals and polishes the silver. She does everything, and we do nothing. She's paid, yes. She has free room and board, and her own bathroom, yes. But we're not a very nice family. I wonder how she tolerates Mother's temper, David's fits, Daddy's drinking, and me. So at the very end of part one, Mother must make a decision, a terrible decision. Since David won't leave his apartment, he must be removed. To avoid eviction and perhaps arrest, he must be forcibly removed. The door must be forced open and David taken out. Mother asked Duncan to help. Duncan is my cousin Nancy's husband. I don't know what Duncan does. I'm not with him inside the apartment. I'm outside the apartment house with Mother. But David is dragged out of his apartment. We stand in the street while he's dragged into an ambulance. The doors of the ambulance close and we watch it roll away. When I think of this moment, this terrible moment, I see the horizon, the street, the ambulance, the horizon. I see the ambulance moving towards the horizon into a terrible unknown. I hear the echo of David's voice. He's shouting. I can't remember if he really shouted or if I heard the shouts exploding inside him. His shouts surround my memory of the ambulance as it moves towards the horizon and disappears. David, the shouts, the ambulance, they all disappear. Thank you.
I just want to make a few ditto marks echoing gratitude to Leslie and the Hillside Club and John for organizing and these wonderful writers for being here, grappling with truths of their lives. And truth is something that has become so elusive in our time that it feels healing in a way to be able to try to confront that. So I'm going to talk about my book, Hugging My Father's Ghost, and the book is about someone I didn't really know very well, namely my dad, Lee Rogo. And my father was a widely published fiction writer in New York City in the early 1950s. He was the reviewer for the Hollywood Reporter for Broadway plays in New York. So he was a drama critic. He was a glamorous man about town in Manhattan. In World War II, he served as the captain of a submarine chaser ship. And he died tragically in a plane crash when I was only 3 years old. For many years, grief really kept me from thinking about my dad. It was easier just kind of not to remember that there was this huge vacuum, in a way, in our family. And so I didn't really think much about his life until probably I became a father. And then somehow that made it more possible emotionally to think about his role in my life. And fortunately, he was a writer, so he left behind quite a bit of writing, including unpublished works that were sitting in my sister's basement in Toronto, Canada for about 50 years. And during COVID, I sifted through this material and I found some treasures and some surprises. So this book is a kind of collage of my father's writings, most of it unpublished, and my own thoughts about that generation, the so-called greatest generation that lived through the Depression and World War II, and then that prosperous time of the 1940s and 50s after the war. And one of the things that I found when I sifted through my dad's writings was that he kept a journal during World War II when he was on this boat. He had never really been on a boat other than the ferry from Bayonne, New Jersey to Manhattan, where he grew up in New Jersey. And there he was an officer not long after Pearl Harbor. There was this program called the 90-Day Wonders, where people who'd never served in the Navy, in order to replace all the leadership in the Navy that had been lost at Pearl Harbor, they were trained in 90 days to become officers in the Navy. And my dad went through this training with the writer Herman Wouk, later to be the writer Herman Wouk. And he wrote some beautiful things in this journal when he was only 23 years old. I'm going to read you a little bit about what he wrote about the sound of the ocean. Its noise is with you always, part splashing, part sighing and moaning, part gurgling, hissing, roaring. You don't hear it most of the time. And at night, it becomes insistent in the quiet of its motion, and it's with you always. In bed, it rocks you, and I get the feeling that my bed is detached from the ship and floating with the motion of the sea. And another passage that really struck me in his journal was about his then girlfriend, who went by the name Sugar with her friends. And she was a nightclub singer, and she was a USO entertainer during the war. He writes, I thought of Sugar in Bermuda, and I thought I would write her a letter saying, when I go to bed, my last waking thought is of you. And when I lean on the rail and look at the yellow moon and its light upon the waters, my thought is of you. I remember you in your black dress when we sat on my raincoat on the lawn until 5 a.m., and how I put the coat around my shoulders and went leaping around the lawn. I remember you in that white terry cloth bathrobe and how your face looked up at me when I kissed you last. And I remember how I nearly swooned against the wall of the bachelor's officers' quarters lounge when I said, I'm crazy for you. And you said, and I'm crazy for you. Perhaps I will write all that to you one day or tell it to you, but I'll save it for now. So I learned from reading this journal that my dad was an unusual guy who could really express what was deepest in his heart. And that was so special at that time for a young male writer, because male writers were trying to out Hemingway. There had to be a gun or a hunter or a fishing rod in every single story, and a woman fawning over them. And my dad was not like that, you know. And so as I mentioned, he trained in the Navy with the novelist Herman Wouk. And Herman Wouk was a very important figure in my parents' generation. He was the first Jewish American writer to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature for his book, The Caine Mutiny. And one thing I found out in writing this book was that the protagonist of The Caine Mutiny is based largely on my dad. And his girlfriend is based on Sugar. And so when The Caine Mutiny was published, my dad, who was also a book reviewer, was asked to review it for the Saturday Review. And strangely, because this book got very good reviews, my dad was one of the few critical reviews of his friend Herman Wouk's book. So because I didn't have much to go on in writing this memoir other than my dad's writings, one of the things I do in the book is I make up scenes where my dad appears, and either he and I are having a conversation or he's having a conversation with his peers. And in this case, I wanted to imagine what happened the first time my dad ran into Herman Wouk after publishing this negative review. So imagine we're at a party on Fire Island, which is a beach resort outside New York City. And my mom and my dad are talking at the party. So my mom says, "Nice party, huh?" And my father says, "Well, if you like having great martinis on a patio overlooking the ocean around sunset and stimulating conversations with brilliant and funny people. Myself, I'd rather be starting a shift in a coal mine." And that was kind of my dad. He had this very ironic sense of humor. He was a very funny man. And my mom said, "Don't look now, Lee, but isn't that Herman Wouk bearing down on you? I think I'm going to go get some of those delicious hors d'oeuvres at the far end of that patio. Can I get you anything?" And my dad says, "Just a shield and a helmet." And my mom says, "Blame the review on me." So exit my mom, enter Herman Wouk. And Herman says, "If it isn't Lee Rogo, I don't know if you remember me. I'm your neighbor here on Fire Island. We were buddies in 90-Day Wonder School. I'm a fellow writer, and our kids play together." So my dad says, "You look vaguely familiar." And Herman Wouk says, "So, been writing any pieces lately for the Saturday Review, Lee?" And Lee says, "Look, Herman, I was all set to give your novel a great review. I'd written a draft, and then Mickey read the book, and she insisted that it needed a more nuanced treatment." And Herman says, "Nuanced? You mean the way a knife in the back is nuanced?" And my dad says, "Like the umpire says, Herman, I calls him as I sees him." And Herman says, "Well, fortunately, the fans never agree with the umps." And my father says, "What do the fans say about writers who use the private information that their buddies tell them about their girlfriends in 90-Day Wonder School?" And Herman says, "Oh, come on, Lee. You're a writer. You know, we're magpies. We grab any shiny object and take it to the nest." And my father says, "Seems to me like you've been taking many shiny objects to the bank lately, Herman. How many weeks has the Caine Mutiny been at the top of the Times bestseller list?" And Herman says, "Sorry, lost count. 33. And my dad says, "So, what are you doing for an encore? Don't tell me you're adapting the novel for Hollywood." And Herman says, "Actually, I am. I hope you're not planning to review the movie." So interestingly, after this review that my dad published, he and Herman Wouk remained friends. And I wonder whether on some level, Herman Wouk appreciated the fact that my dad didn't just give him a friendly pat on the back, that he took his work seriously enough to give it a more nuanced review. And not only did they stay friends, but Herman Wouk delivered the eulogy at my dad's funeral, and he wrote a very beautiful letter that he published about my dad in the Saturday Review, the same publication where my father had published his own review of Herman's book. Thank you.
Do we want to have questions from the audience? Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Did you go to the building it was in front of and ring every bell, or maybe read the notes, or did you not remember what building it is?
The book is really about everything I could think of, including ringing doorbells. In fact, a character came out of the building the next time I went to just look at the site, because I was wandering around posting, this is the second year, posting posters everywhere. And a guy comes out of the building, and I approached him, and he spoke English. And he said that, basically he said he would go all over the neighborhood himself, especially to the art galleries, because this was an area of art galleries. So he talked to a lot of people, and there's correspondence in here between that fellow, Lucien, and some of the art galleries in the neighborhood that wrote very funny and nice things about the painting, but they couldn't really help. So the answer is yes. I rang doorbells. I talked to 1 million people, and that's really what the journey is about. Among many other ways, I reached out to. Is Foster Goldstrom here? Foster, most of you know Foster. He's a San Francisco, former gallery owner in San Francisco, the Foster Goldstrom Gallery. He saw the painting and thought that he could identify who the artist was, a Norwegian artist named Jan Krohn. And so I have correspondence in here with the woman who runs the sort of the gallery that features Jan Krohn. He was in Paris at the time. He painted paintings that have certain similar characteristics. I'm now actually leaning a little bit more towards Jan Krohn than I was before because I've noticed some things about the painting. So yes, I've reached out a lot. The poster was posted inside and outside the apartment building. The neighbors were talked to. One theory is that whoever threw it out was too embarrassed to admit that they had thrown it out. That's one theory. Another theory is, and then I'm going to let this go. Another theory is that somebody from outside the area saw a pile, someone outside the area came to this district of art galleries and thought this painting that they don't want might be wanted by someone who's interested in art. Obviously, the person who threw it out was not that interested in art because it's a pretty damn good painting. So maybe that was it. It was someone from outside the neighborhood who left it, because that happens in Paris. You leave things that seem appropriate for different neighborhoods.
Any other questions? Yes.
When have you achieved enough of your destination, either to complete the destiny or enough of the destiny that you can finish the book?
You guys want to answer that?
It's a good question. That's a very difficult question. I don't think I have a neat answer to that question, but I will say that once I started writing this book, my life began to change, both because I think I was getting healthier as I was sort of recovering from what's been called a disease of relationships, hanging out with too many people on drugs, and but also because this piece of work started taking on its own kind of puzzling momentum, and by the end I felt I was sort of writing. I would write a scene and as it was sort of taking place, and I think I started to sort of control the events of my life that way. I wrote my way out of the relationship I wrote about, and that was very satisfying. I would be like, he left the room, and he would leave the room. I'm like, ooh, am I doing this? So maybe those things converged for me.
Paul Verlaine, the French poet who said, works of art are never finished, they're only abandoned. And at a certain point...
I think Da Vinci said that, but...
So at a certain point, if you want to finish something, you've just got to feel like you gave it your best shot. And there are so many things I could have added to this memoir later, but I sort of feel like you just get to a point where you've got to have closure, and that's a good thing.
I would say that one of the interesting things about being an artist, a writer, and when I compare it with other endeavors that people do in their life, oftentimes they train themselves to solve a problem, a doctor, a plumber, a baker. They're solving some kind of problem that's ready-made. And I think with a book, for me, I have to both invent the problem and then the solution. And that's what I'm exploring. And so destination sort of becomes how the problem reveals itself, and then how I might, in fact, solve it or not. It's really, it doesn't always get solved, I can tell you.
Any other questions?
Let me just add to that, just a funny little thing. The author Borges, who writes very wild stories, improbable stories, has a short story called The Book of Sand. And it's about a book that never stops being written. And I think that that, in a way, is true for all writers, that our books seem finished and they're published. But for us, I think they keep being written. And sometimes they get written as sequel, then there's sequels, or there's revisions. And so there are, some of the classics have never really been finished because they keep being retranslated and reinterpreted. So it really does keep going on.
This is life.
Yes,
Yes,
except life does end.
yes.
What was the best croque monsieur?
There was a correspondence between, and I hate to say it, it's true. The more expensive the croque, the better. Not because they were more expensive, but because, it's really just a little snack. Historically, it's just a snack thing. But as you pay more for your snacks, like at the Café de Paris, their Café de la Pays had a 25 euro croque monsieur. I mean, usually they're between $7 and $12, or 12 euros, whatever. And it was just elaborate and fabulous, and it came with salad. And the center of the croque was cut out, and the circle was placed next to the sandwich that had the big hole in it, and in the hole was the salad. So it was visually wonderful, and that was the best and the most expensive croque.
Sounds amazing.
Yes.
What about Stinson Beach?
John, you had a party at your house where a chef prepared something similar, which sounded just as good, if not better.
Well, we invented a croque monsieur with a chef in the Bay Area named, what is his name? Peter Jackson. He had cooked at Stars and 4th Street Grill. Wonderful cook, and we spent some time in Paris together when I went back with the poster, and we were going to have a croque monsieur party to celebrate the end of my poster mission. So I invited some friends, and we came across truffled ham from Italy at the Bon Marché. And so we made truffled croques, and they were so good that I had to do it in Berkeley, so we did that recently in Berkeley. But we couldn't find truffled ham, so we used truffled cheese. And it's the best croques we've ever had. and the least expensive.
Yes.
Avenues for memoir writers to pursue. Do any of you have anything to say about Avery's work, or did it have any impact whatsoever on you? It had none on me.
That book definitely had an impact on me. I remember reading it and thinking it was unusually honest and very funny and both intellectual and kind of playful, like really exciting writing. And I regret to say I haven't read much Dave Eggers since then, but that one had a profound effect on me.
Yes.
What's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography?
That's a really great question. I wanted to ask that myself. Do you?
The autobiography is the whole life. The memoir is what they call a slice of life. And usually autobiographies are written at the end of a writer's life, so you get the whole picture. And the memoir is written at any particular stage, looking back at a small, earlier part of your life.
That a memoir is more of a literary form, and an autobiography is more of a recounting of facts.
A question in the back there? Yes.
It's more really exemplified in the story of Herman Wow taking your dad's story, from an encounter as young men and using that to make his fortune.
I think there is an ethical question that some people struggle with. In my case, everyone in my nuclear family was deceased with the death of my brother, which is a certain kind of permission. But I had written about my family when at least my father died when I was 19, so that's early on. But I had written about my mother for sure when she was alive. I don't know. I know people feel very uncomfortable doing that. And of course, it can lead to legal battles and all kinds of, people never talk to you again. But I didn't scruple about that personally when I was writing about people who were still living. And in this case, it was not difficult to even have to think about it.
I think there's a certain amount of license and variation in the memoir genre that allows you to change things when you think that it might be problematic. And that brings up the question, and actually it's a question for the audience, for the panel, and that is the distinction between memoir and certain variations in fiction, autofiction, hybrid fiction, where people like Patrick Modiano writes about his life and mixes with his historical explorations. Dora Bruder was a major work that I considered in my book because he takes 10 years to locate this story behind a young girl who's ultimately killed in the concentration camps. But I'm wondering if there are moments in your books where you take license, where you modify and hide the identities of some of the people you talk about and fictionalize.
I was going to ask you, Nina, what was your family's really, the book is about your family, so what was their reaction to it?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I had a strong desire to make sure that I wasn't saying anything that anyone objected to on factual grounds, or that I wasn't hurting anyone's feelings. So my family, with whom I'm very close, all read a draft of it, as did the ex that I write about in this book, as did other characters in the book. So I did circulate this work, and everyone was surprisingly supportive. And I still asked myself ethical questions about just representing experiences that are this personal. But I kept remembering the books I've read that take fewer risks, and they're not that interesting. And I thought there were lots of ways I could have edited to sort of like protect the real truth of what happened. But it's been very freeing to sort of detach myself from caring about those kinds of perceptions of me or things I've done or other choices my sister made 30 years ago or something, and just tell the truth.
I was wondering, how do you remember things? There's like so many details from so many years past. So, did
Zach
you keep?
was going to say something, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to respond to the previous question,
Okay.
which was I sort of took the opposite approach. I understand what Nina did, and I honor that, but what I did is I didn't show my draft to anyone in the family because I didn't want to be swayed by their take on what had happened, particularly my sister, who went through all of this with me. My sister has a way of coping with difficulties in the past by focusing on the positive, and I wanted to get all the three-dimensional story in here, because there are a lot of stories about my dad that are just presenting him as a kind of one-dimensional heroic character, and I knew there was more to it than that. And what I really wanted to do was not dig up the dirt, but just see him as a human being, really.
I want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to amend what I had said before, because there's one very small section in Dust where my son's half-brother dies, and he's in his maybe early 30s. And it's a very complicated story that I won't, of course, go into because we don't have the time and whatever. But with that section of the book, I did let my son read it and ask him if, of course, it's my framing. It's the way I remember how this happened. And so in a way, I have a kind of ownership on that memory, actually. But I wanted to make sure that he thought that I wasn't going to be hurting anyone's feelings, because in this family there are my son and 3 half-brothers by 2 other women. So the whole thing is just kind of complicated. And he thought it was fine. But in fact, then other people read it after the book was published, and I heard how upset they were with it. And I was sorry about that, but that was the way I remembered how the death unfolded.
Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about memory. My stance, because I don't trust myself that I will remember exactly the feeling that I had at that time.
I was wondering if you kept journals and if that was part of it.
Oh, yeah, my journals were big, yes.
But
yes.
a lot of writers talk about how in the writing, their memory comes to them. It's as if you are discovering your memories as you write them down, as you write. And it's sort of like somehow they get brought to the surface. I mean, just as, you're lying on the couch in your therapist's office and your memories start to come forward. The writer is self-therapizing himself a lot of the time and dealing with his past through the writing itself.
Yeah, I would add to that a close friend, someone who's known me for many years, asked me when she read this book, she said, "How did you remember all that?" And my answer to her was, because of course, I remember more than that. How do you select the memory is really often the issue for the writer. But I said to her, well, these are the memories that made me. I mean, the memories that you remember, I think, are the memories that made you, if you get what I mean. I mean, you remember things from childhood, teenage years, every decade you have memories. But why do you remember those and not others? And so that was my attitude, that if I remembered them so strongly, that they were inside me so prominently that...
I want to quote a memoirist that actually, beyond David Edgar's, Annie Ernaux, who won the Nobel Prize.
I thought of her too.
She's a French memoirist. She doesn't accept the label, but that's what she does. And here's what she wrote. I have a couple of quotes that I wanted to read tonight. And here it is.
Will these be a nice way to close out the program, you think?
It's up to you, dear.
I think we're...
Okay.
Yeah,
She writes, "I shall process memories like documents, examining them from different angles to give them meaning. In other words, I shall carry out an ethnological study of myself." Now, to balance that out, I have a quote from Oscar Wilde in a book he wrote called The Critic as Artist in 1890. "As a rule, I dislike modern memoirs. They are generally written by people who have entirely lost their memories or have never done anything worth remembering."
That's a good note to close.
I believe the authors have some books here. If you want to have them buy them and have them sign them.
The other thing is, if you don't want to get our books now, which we understand,
yes.
there are other methods of obtaining these
Local
books.
bookstores, bookshop.org, and what other?
Thrift,
And thrift books.
Carries all our...
plus all of our lingering independent bookstores.
Independent bookstores.
The ones that are still here.
Yeah.
Let's keep them here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. you. Thanks, everybody.